Hello everyone, I am Mimi Nyaba, a food researcher at African Center for Cities. I am joined today by Gareth Haysom, a senior researcher at the African Center for Cities. And we'll be speaking about mandates as relating to urban food access by posing the question, who wakes up and worries about food? To set us off, I'll read this story called Everybody by Loli Daskal. And it goes, this is a story about four people named Everybody, Somebody, Anybody, and Nobody. There was an important job to be done, and everybody was sure that somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought anybody could do it, but nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do it. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anybody could have. Welcome, Gareth, after that. And I just want to ask you, what is your takeaway from the story, specifically relating to the issue of mandate and food access in cities?
Thanks, Winnie. I think for me this is a wonderful story because it encapsulates the challenge that we see in cities and that we are trying to actually understand how we unbundle that absent mandate, that fact that nobody, anybody or somebody does anything. I think for us in cities there are three things to think about around that particular question. One is when we don't act, it doesn't have neutral outcomes, it has negative outcomes. The second point is, for cities, anybody, somebody else has always managed the food system. Be it national governments who provide funding and arrange for agriculture and manage the food system at a national scale, and the private sector who might then enable food to come through. So the cities will often say to us, we don't have a city mandate. The third point around this is that cities absolutely have a mandate. They have a mandate or an obligation imposed on them through the right to food in the Constitution. The same applies across many African countries as well. But cities actively act in the food system. The decisions that cities make actually influence how the food system functions. And so while they might not have an explicit food mandate, they absolutely have a whole set of other mandates within the urban governance domain that actively drive what happens. But equally, they have another mandate to engage with society and find out how city is engaging. And everyone eats, maybe not all well, but everyone eats in a city. So how that knowledge and how that group feeds into how cities function and how they manage their food systems and the mandates that they adopt to engage the food system is an incredibly important question. And this point of saying that everybody, somebody, nobody does anything reflects where we sit at the moment. So for me, the real question is, how do we move from this absent mandate to a situation where cities actively take on a mandate?
Yeah, I mean, even as I was reading this the story, it got very murky as to whose mandate it is specifically, and I think that's what the problem is in that sense. And it shows us that food is really also not a standalone responsibility. And I'm thinking about how perhaps you can help our students understand this food-related responsibility or functions with planning. Like what, for example, would the health department be responsible for? And what aspects of food would sit with infrastructure for relation to food access? I think what I'm asking is a more specific example within the department of what this mandate would look like.
So in a city, a health department would have really pressing primary healthcare needs. They need to manage pre- and postnatal care. They need to manage a whole set of issues. And someone else might be managing food, but a key part of food is nutrition. So what happens when a mother conceives? What happens? What does that mean for their diet? How are those mothers helped through a process through a health department? How do they learn to start understanding the changes in their bodies through food, but also what their food needs might be? But right the way through, from conception all the way through, because the first 1,000 days are essential to the foundational kind of development of anybody. The other part about it is, how do the the health department engage with other departments? You mentioned planning. What it might be if they start to see a sudden rise in diarrhea, and what that might mean for the water and sanitation department. The health department is a proverbial canary in a coal mine. They're seeing the implications while others might not necessarily be managing their departments well. So if people are presenting with diarrhea, they're not getting the nutrition. They might be eating, but those nutrients are not being absorbed into their bodies. And as a result of that, the health department then needs to take on a food role. But that's not about engaging food. It's about engaging water and sanitation. It's about engaging other factors that might be influencing and creating that challenge. And so the health department is perhaps one that understands, because of nutrition, that they have a role to play in food, what the food might be, the utilization of that food, the quality of that food. But they also need to then start to engage in other departments who might be undermining that ability to engage and act and gain health. Or how they might be engaging in other departments whose actions might be undermining the health outcomes. And this might appear not to be a food question, it's something else, but nutrition is absolutely a food question. And how that child or that person who is reflecting there with an illness, how does a health department create a wellness enhancing environment, means that they have to focus on their policies and approaches, but equally look at how other departments' policies and approaches are impacting the outcomes of the health and nutrition of their patients and those that they're responsible for in the urban space.
That's very interesting. I think I'm going to draw from the mother-child story, and I'm thinking about the Nosipo video, and we talk about, it presents the idea of petals, and it really also, I think I will ask you to elaborate a little bit on that, but it really gives this idea of that one department influencing another, and I think petals also act in the same way. And yeah, can you please elaborate a bit more on what the petals are and what their role is in relation to food in cities?
So the petals are this graphic that looks like a flower with all its different petals, and there are 6 petals. So there's the food system petal, but linked to that is the health system that we've spoken about, but also the urban system as a third petal. We then also have the economic system, so another petal that sits around the economy. But we also have the social services system, and we have the social system. The food system is obviously trying to understand how food works. We've said cities don't necessarily have a mandate, but they're issuing licenses to informal vendors. They're controlling markets. They're arranging for the permitting and who might be able to trade in those markets. They might be doing health inspections to see who has got a health certificate, or also checking on how vendors, supermarkets, etc., might be engaging in the sort of health and safety components of that system. So they are managing the food system, but not just from a point of they may be policing rather than trying to be developmental in that food system. The health system we've discussed. The urban system is a key component, because there you have things, as I mentioned, like water and sanitation, but also spatial planning. How do you determine where food lands in various different parts of the city? Where can people trade? Where can't people trade? What does it mean for how you rezone a particular area? What does it mean for a new housing development? How do they have to travel to get food? Are you being food sensitive in terms of how a new housing development, an area might evolve? How do you engage food in the informal settlements that are often not governed effectively or not governed at all? So what does that mean for the food system in those areas? As the Nosipo story tells about being worried about gas and cooking with a primus stove and things like that. The social services sector is around how things like school feeding, how the support to the indigent, how social grants, pensions, etc. feed into that. The social system is as important, because this is the networks, the ways in which people build a form of resilience through the relationships that they build and hold with people. As an example, after a fire in Cape Town, one of the mothers didn't want to move in with family members because she said she had no idea how long it would take for a house to be built. She rather went to stay in a shelter because she said she doesn't know if she will ever be able to repay that favor that that other family member might have offered to her by taking them in. And so these social systems are as important, often working within families, but also generational. Things like stokvels and buying clubs are all part of that social system. And then the economy is an obvious one, but obviously not just the informal sector, but also how the economy works from a small street vendor selling a magwinya, a mandazi, a Rolex, or whatever it might be called in many different cities. The Rolex is the pancake, not the watch. So what that means in these different cities, right the way to a highly formal sort of e-platform mobile delivery system, that entire economy and the food economy, they intersect with the city in all these different spaces. The reason we use the petals is because they all come together and touch at that particular location. And if they don't, there's a deficit in that particular space. And so the governance objective, who wakes up and worries, means everybody has to wake up and worry. The great challenge is someone still has to be the key person worrying about that, so they don't have the anybody, nobody, somebody story again. But there needs to be someone who takes a mandate to say, in this particular point, be it in Bandani in Kisumu or Mfuleni in Cape Town or in a site outside Harare or somewhere like that, like Epworth, someone has to worry about how those petals intersect. And for me, that's the governance question. That's what cities need to wake up and worry about, is the intersections. Rather than saying we need a Ministry of Food, what we need to say is how does food sit and intersect in all those different petals to enable a just and equitable food system in an urban space.
That's beautiful. And I want to then, before we turn to our contributors, this is a bit of the last question, is what would you like to add that our students should keep in mind when listening to all these contributions?
So I think what is really important is to ask, why haven't cities governed food for so long? So there is, in the course, we engage in historical deficits relating to this. We engage in a whole set of other processes around how we define food security, how the various different economic actors play out. But for the students, I think it's really important to start to say, in the city that I live in these spaces that I'm going to engage, what does that food system look like? Who is waking up and worrying about that food system? But at the same time, who's not worrying about it? So this fact that someone should be doing that, that's the governance question. The other point for me is to say that this isn't just about government in terms of governance. It's about what knowledge does society hold. I made reference to that earlier. These multiple different groups acting in the food system, supporting small-scale growers, supporting feeding kitchens, soup kitchens or feeding things or community kitchens. These different actors are actively engaging in the food system every day and have knowledge that government or the state doesn't have. And so the other question is, how are these different knowledge groups connected? And how do we bring them together to assist in the governance of a particular town or city? But again, there needs to be someone who wakes up and worries about that. And how do we do that? And so for the students, again, how do you work transversely across departments that haven't in the past worried about food? And how do we get them to worry? And that for me is the key question, because for cities of the South, we have the opportunity to redraft how governance happens in cities, how food and governance plays out. And so how do you then start to think what that redrafting of food systems governance might look like?
Well, thank you so much for your insights. And yeah, I'd be quite interested to see what that future looks like, where the governance and society at large comes together. We hope that you, our viewers, have enjoyed this section of the MOOC, and we look forward to you joining us again soon. Thank you.
Thanks.